Welcome back to Drunk on Writing, and the second of 4 special Stephen King Dissection Addendums, brought to you in part through the patronage of Ariya Norinth and David, where we're continuing our deep dive into The Stand, in particular, Book 2, On the Border and the Events of July 5th through September 6th, 1990, which, before we go any further into this video, I want to apologize to Stephen King. When I first did a video on The Stand a few years back, I railed against how long the book is, particularly this section, which I said felt like a bit of a chore to get through. But today, after reading the book a third time, I have to say, I really enjoyed this section. I know, it's awesome and it's brilliant. I take back everything I said against it. Almost. It's still too long. I'm probably going to have to apologize again at some point, aren't I? Before we go much further, if you'd like to hear my thoughts on Book 1 of The Stand, Captain Trips, which hits home like never before thanks to COVID, be sure to head on over to drunkonwriting.com or youtube.com/drunkonwriting to check out the last video, as well as the full library of Stephen King dissections. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe too, so you can get the heads up on the next video, and why not become a patron while you're at it? You can get instant access to exclusive podcasts, videos, wallpapers, and more. Now, I think On the Border finally popped for me because I was finally able to get past the overly long, character-centric, flashback and remembrance-centric chapters, and the meandering, convoluted, and often repetitive coming together plot to get at the core of what seems to be King's true intention for Book 2. A heartfelt exploration of humanity's struggle and desire to be good. But when I finished reading and started working on this dissection, though I came to it with a surprising excitement and planned on talking your ear off today about this book's masterful character evolutions, I had it all written out and bulleted and everything, that old feeling crept up on me again, and I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help but wonder, how would I feel? Would I like it more if the book were shorter? Keep in mind, to this point, I've only read the complete uncut edition, which is what's predominantly been in bookstores since 1991. But the first edition of The Stand, the incomplete cut edition, the one where King was forced to remove rather large chunks to meet not editorial demands, but accounting ones. Honestly, no, true. As detailed in the uncut edition's preface, the accounting department toted up production costs, laid these next to the hardcover sales of my previous 4 books, and decided that a cover price of $12.95 was about what the market would bear. I was asked if I would like to make the cuts or if I would prefer someone in the editorial department to do it. I reluctantly agreed to do the surgery myself. That post-op edition, it's still out there, if you look. And while I didn't feel like forking over the cash for a first edition of this originally 1978 novel, I did hop on eBay and get this, an original paperback copy. I know this version has different years. The setting was changed from 1980 to 1985 for this release. It's exactly, otherwise, what you'd have gotten in that first hardcover. And after some pretty rigorous comparisons, I ran out of the sticky flags. I keep a whole pad of them. I ran out of those twice over. I was keeping way too many notes for this. Though it is definitely not perfect, I think, at least for me, this is the better version of the story. And that bothers me. After all, after reading Book 1, Captain Trips, which was also expanded in 1991 with chapters not in the original release, I never thought it was too long. Go back, and watch that last video. Because I think it's pretty clear that I loved Book 1. I loved its story, its depth, its speed. I said it last time, so much happens to so many, in so many places, it's almost hard to keep up. And yet, I would adore more of it. Book 2, literally the opposite. I think there should be less of it, but not less of everything. This feeling is specific to the first half of Book 2, specific to the portion of the novel dedicated to bringing our heroes together. Because once they are all gathered in Boulder and the story actually progresses, I love it. It's fantastic. Everything from the good and evil tug of war to the intricacies of bringing power back and in between just hits. But the road there is mentally and literarily exhausting, and it makes settling into the nuanced bureaucracies of establishing a new civilization simply come off as boring. We go from devil tornadoes and rape caravans and psychotic drunk drivers to cleanup and committees and the tactical equivalent of a chessboard. Though it's insanely well written and punctuated with narrative turns aplenty, how can readers not find this political intrigue after the last several hundred pages of sheer insanity a little anticlimactic? I have to believe somewhere deep down that back when he was taking a scalpel to the book, the little editor deep down inside Stephen King had a similar feeling, because in the original release, in just this portion of Book 2, more than 100 pages were removed, nearly halving the time it takes us to reach Colorado. Specifically, Stu and Glenn up on the mountain preparing, planning, and outlining, basically giving us a true taste of what's to come of the novel moving forward. What more? Except for a few instances where sections were replaced with comparably awkward, truncated alternate versions, such as the zoo being swapped with a simple breakdown, or the kid with a perverted old man who uneventfully dies of a heart attack. The cuts are, other than those, mostly unnoticeable and unmissed. Which, again, the fact that I'm so drawn to the Stan's cut version that I feel like the uncut version gets in its own way. It bugs me. Like, I mean, what's the deal? I generally love King's writing, and I generally love most of this book, so why wouldn't I like more of it? What is it about this specific material that so kills the momentum and my experience, my enjoyment of the story? Let's recap what was taken out and then put back in this pre-Boulder section, shall we? We'll just concentrate right there. We have the random flag-controlled tornado and the haunted cellar. Extra doses of Inspector Underwood, now with added Sergeant Briggs. Far more comparisons to quote-unquote before. Of course, the zoo. The kid I've already mentioned as well, but along with him we get more Trash Can Man. We get a lot more Abagail Fremantle, a lot more about her life and loves. We get the sad side story of Mark and Perion, I think I said that right, a Stovington's Plague Center retread. One or two or possibly even three, they all seem to kind of blend together. Additional entries in Frannies' journal that all seem to kind of focus on psychoanalyzing Harold. There seemed to be quite a lot of that. I don't know exactly why all of that was cut, but maybe I do. A Vegas-style crucifixion, and an almost overwhelming bevy of character study and contextual detail and thought and dialogue scattered throughout. Looking at that list, is this content necessary? I mean, it was originally cut, so no. Does it add to the plot? Maybe. But specific to Book 2 here, does it push the sense of being on the border, or in any way help characters become who they're meant to be? Or at the very least, more than who they were before Captain Trips? Or is this all just character backstory and world building for the sake of character backstory and world building? More importantly, though, and this is the question that I think we really have to answer here tonight, does including it hurt the overall narrative, bog down what, at its essence, is a tantalizingly interesting premise? And does including it serve, as King hoped it wouldn't, as an act of indulgence by an author whose works haven't been successful enough to allow it? Well, let's take a closer look at the reinsertion, shall we? Starting with the tornado. I think it's safe to say, including this in the book's opening chapter, Book 2's opening chapter, which is anchored by half-blind, deaf-mute Nick getting his groove on and turning a tad misogynistic, and newly introduced and mentally disabled Tom drunkenly playing with toy cars and spelling everything Moon, really pushes their situation over the top, even for this book. It's silly, out of place, and compared to what surrounds it, very first draft like. Wearing Tolkien's influences right on its sleeve. Heck, Tom even has a full-on Samwise Gamgee moment when he steps beyond Harper County. While it could be said the tornado strengthens the relationship between Nick and Tom, does it? How? Because Tom saved Nick from the tornado? He didn't. He may have tapped Nick on the shoulder and said, hey, tornado, but then he screamed and biked right the heck out of there. Together, yes, they survived a harrowing experience, and for that they will forever be intertwined, but they also just survived a plague that wiped out mankind. They also are sole survivors of their respective towns who simply help each other just be alive. We'll see something similar at the novel's end. And they also, both just got shot. I know, I'm going on and on here, but my point is, I don't see that as a reason to necessitate the tornado's inclusion. It's done elsewhere. On the other hand, if you were to say the tornado helps to bring Flag to the forefront in a way otherwise mostly avoided in this book, and that's why this is important to include, I think I just might have to agree with you, though I also think that is the wrong approach. We'll come back to that. What about Larry's Inspector Underwood inner monologues? Now, I will point out, okay, these were referenced once or twice in the first cut, but almost jarringly so. They never really quite made sense. So adjusting the narrative so these are less throwaway and more a result of Larry simply losing his mind makes their inclusion far more compelling. But given they introduce a second facet, a third really, if you count Briggs, to Larry's personality, the Inspector Underwood asides unfortunately diminish the importance of something they really probably shouldn't later on in the book. Now, if you recall, Larry unwittingly visits Fran while looking for Harold, and the two end up having a lovely little tete-a-tete. This is important because it inevitably leads to the discovery of Harold's ledger, but perhaps equally important, during that discussion, Larry recaps and reflects on his journey, traveling to New York, the death of his mother, his short time with Rita, Maine, Nadine, and Joe, and so on and so forth. And while he's talking, he vehemently refers to his pre-Boulder self in the third person, as a different person, because he's changed. He's found himself. He's come out the other side. And Inspector Underwood, whether we'd like to admit it or not, is little more than an artifact from the more pompous life Larry is doing what he can to put behind him. Speaking of the before stuff, I rather like all of it that's been inserted, but especially the additional background details we get for Nadine and Lucy. It really helps to build a base for them and several others, a starting point, and clarify their individual journeys and individual needs. Of all the reinsertions, this to me is definitely the most welcome. See, it's not all bad. Which brings us to the zoo. Actually, no. You know what? Let's come back to that and touch instead on Mark and Perion, a side quest of sorts that really has no long-term impact and feels akin to an expanded excerpt from Book 1's so-called Second Pandemic. That felt a little mean. Let me bring it back a little bit. Take it on its own, okay? I really like this segment. I just want to put that out there. But, come on. Stu has his hands in the abdomen of someone he knows, who then dies, and prompts their lover's suicide. That should affect him. But it doesn't. Granted, from the very beginning, he's been an internally stronger character than his quiet facade makes him seem. Heck, I mean, he barely blinked when half his town died miserable deaths in Atlanta. But even that said, what's the point of this side plot, especially here in this section, if it doesn't actually change anything about our main characters? What? to show how important doctors are, to show they're actually needed despite proving rather useless during the Captain Trips outbreak? Don't we already know that, though? And if we don't, surely the developments later on with Fran's pregnancy bear that out, right? Making this, while I think an overall effective piece, simply repetitive and superfluous. Which I think we could also say about the jaunt through Stovington, which plays out sort of like a previously on recap. And we could definitely say that about the other entries in Fran's diary, which are very detailed for a diary, and while perhaps accurate in their assessment of Harold, more than a bit harsh and demeaning. I mean, you kind of get why he'd be pissed. Not kill you pissed, but, pissed enough. I don't blame him on that part. I mean, again, don't think you should probably kill anybody off of the diary, but still, I could be upset. Understand, man. Actually, they're almost doubly dispensable, given those additional minor dialogue description and diatribe inserts and updates oh so carefully inserted and integrated throughout the section. I mean, you get to know the characters without being told about the characters. Something else, perhaps we could also call repetitive, if not superfluous? I think people are going to be mad about this one. The kid. To be honest, I have a love-hate relationship with his part of the story. On the one hand, I think the kid himself is fascinating. Over the top in much the same way as the tornado, but in a way that generally works in the world King's built. Again, though, I have to ask, who or what does his inclusion in the narrative actually serve? Trash Can Man? He's definitely not one of those on the border. No, our novel's Deus Ex Machina never seemed to me to need extra convincing, especially such cruel convincing. So, if we remove that as a case for this section's inclusion, this through line boils down to, as potentially with the tornado, bringing Flag to the forefront, showing off his powers, his influence. Take this and the tornado out, and the most we see him, literally, I suppose, is, okay, still at the end of this chapter, after the Crucifixion, which, let me just put on the record, is horrific and gut-wrenching and totally unnecessary, bringing absolutely zero to the overall plot other than verification of the atrocity, though that probably would have been and is a better fit in Book 3. But without the kid, without the tornado, as presented in the original cut, Flag is basically a presence, a boogeyman in existential dread, an all-seeing Tolkienish eye, but largely an unknown, unquantifiable threat, which is cool. I dig that. But putting any kind of face on him at this point, when the majority of our characters seemingly consider him and refer to him as the agent of the devil, when Tom, in his lucid, hypnotized state, describes him in the most sinister, evil way I could possibly imagine. He looks like anybody you see on the street. But when he grins, birds fall dead off telephone lines. When he looks at you a certain way, your prostate goes bad and your urine burns. The grass yellows up and dies where he spits. He's always outside. He came out of time. He doesn't know himself. He has the name of 1,000 demons. Jesus knocked him into a herd of pigs once. His name is Legion. I mean, there's a lot there, and it's kind of terrifying, especially for our leads, where this is, this is a real thing that's been invading their dreams. But still, Flag is always an arm apart. Bringing him closer, showing us the extent of his powers, at this point, eats away at the weight of that depiction. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, what about the weasels? Surely that's as blatant an example of Flag's power and influence. Well, besides the fact that that was in the original cut of the novel, there's a reason I haven't brought it up. Mother Abagail. Who is she? Why should we listen to her, especially later on in the book, after the explosion, the assassination, Nick? I mean, who is she to tell anyone, let alone our main characters, to go anywhere? Mother Abagail should be this messianic figure, right? She should be larger than life, otherworldly, God's chosen one. But until the very end, she's just old, with a touch of the same shine everyone else now has, and the reinserted narrative further exploring her life and times while she struggles to walk down a driveway and back doesn't exactly help. I'll tell you what, if some old lady said I had to walk west to my almost certain doom, potentially to be crucified, and that I couldn't bring a thing with me except the clothes on my back, and that I had to do it right now, yeah, well, needless to say, I don't think that I would. But if this section were rejiggered somewhat, if the first time we saw Mother Abagail wasn't her tottering out on the porch and then handling her morning constitution, but instead was postponed until she meets Nick, and, why not? Make it from Nick's perspective instead, too. And she said her whole mysterious, all-knowing, hello, Nick line. And then she fed everyone that amazing corn and chicken after they'd been living off scraps. Putting it in that perspective, that changes quite a bit. Frames our story in a different light. Puts more emphasis on the hearsay, the rumors, and for us, on Trash Can Man's dream, where he doesn't see her as an old woman, but as some secret, some barely concealed light that seemed ready to break out all around her, to play over her with a fiery brilliance that would make the flaming oil tanks of Gary seem like so many candles in the wind, a light so bright it would chalk his eyes to cinders. That's pretty significant, and if properly emphasized, would bring that much more significance to On the Border's ending as well. After all, Mother Abagail does become that messianic figure. She heals Frannie. She speaks in another person's voice. She delivers an edict from her so-called killer god. Building on this would help strengthen the sheer apocalyptic level madness, the twisted fairy tale our characters have found themselves tossed into. I mean, they can compare to Noah. They're told they're part of a chess game between God and Satan, that flag's going to sweep out of the West and enslave everyone left alive, first in America, then in the rest of the world. That's some serious weight on their shoulders. I mean, that's a lot. But delivered by someone who gets uncomfortable, putting in false teeth, it feels weird. I was talking about the kid, though. Whether or not he and his inclusion strengthens the story. To be blunt, it doesn't. He doesn't. In fact, there's one blink and you'll miss it interaction within the section that, in case you did miss it, entirely hurts the story because it disrupts and undermines Trash Can Man's character development in just the stupidest way. In his reinserted adventure with the kid, we get this throwaway line from Trash Can Man's perspective. The kid offered his hand and Trash shook it as quick as he could so that the kid could put both hands back on the wheel. Nothing terrible, though nothing terribly memorable either, which is probably why it wasn't until this read that this sentence, from just slightly later on in the story, only about 10 pages or so, but date-wise later as well, on an entirely different state with entirely different people. But yes, this finally stood out to me. Trash Can Man shook the offered hand and had to struggle to keep from weeping with gratitude. So far as he could remember, this was the first time in his life someone had offered to shake his hand. Look, it's minor, okay? It's nitpicking to the nth degree. I get that. But I'm an editor, and stuff like this takes me so out of the story so fast when I recognize it. And unfortunately, it's not the only example of conflicting or confusing or repetitive narrative just within this section of the book. There's also the way Larry's motorcycle overheats twice, and it's apparently a big deal both times, or the way Stu and Frannie's segments so often end with the two running off to have sex. I mean, I guess, like my dad's joked over the years, what else are you going to do when the power is out? Or the way Stu still seems mystified up on that mountain as to what exactly Glenn does, despite having multiple in-depth conversations with the guy. Listen, I can probably find excuses for all of these inconsistencies. I earned myself some sort of Stephen King no prize for excusing them, and the others I happen to flag. As I've said, there were quite a few. But there's one. There's one that I can't excuse. And it perfectly highlights the overarching issue of these reinsertions. They don't truly matter. They don't influence any of the rest of the book. If they did, by all rights, this part that I'm about to explain, this would play a much larger role in the stand than it does. Let's go back to the zoo. I love this section. I just want to put that out there. It's exciting. It's remarkable. It's desperate times, Last of Us, gun-blazing action, atop a rather gruesome take on post-society America. Seriously, though, it's been like, what, a few weeks at this point since the fall of civilization, and they're already resorting to drugging women so they can violently and repeatedly rape them? Yeah, it's probably not that far-fetched. Problematic, questionable rape parade aside, this section is everything I want this book to be. But during this battle, this shootout, something pretty significant happens. Harold kills a person. Harold fired his gun again, King wrote. The second man's body jumped. He stopped screaming. This after Stu shot the guy in the stomach. Now, Harold, if you don't remember, is 16 years old. Harold, if you don't remember, is a bookworm. Harold, you might recall, is turned to the dark side via his virgin penis. Because until Captain Trips, he was fat, nerdy, pimply, and by all accounts, a jackass, or rather horny jackass, as we're told over and over. Dude's got quite the leather fetish, but by all indications, including those multiple in-depth Frannie journal analyses, he's not, at his core, a bad person. He's one on the border. And his struggle between being an asset to the community or being an asset to Flag is the backbone for this section. So why doesn't killing a man affect him? Surely, of all things, that should play into his arc, help lead to his downfall. After all, just like he's never had sex before, and that's the inevitable driver for his decisions, including the decision to murder the committee, he's undoubtedly never killed before. I mean, it certainly feels that way when he loses his nerve just on the verge of shooting Stu, doesn't it? Also feels rather like it in the build-up to him whispering his fate away, wouldn't you say? Yet during all of that, why doesn't this murder, this first murder, even if it was an act of self-defense, even if it was an act of mercy, cross his mind? Well, the truth is, either King forgot to stick in another line or so, or the book was retooled beyond his original edits more than we know. I think it's more likely the former, but I have to say, I wish the time and attention had been paid to build on this development beyond Harold's simple shell-shocked response. We wiped them out, didn't we, Stu? We blew them up, scragged their asses, as well as man, but we had to. It was them or us. Yes, that is entirely his reaction. That is the entirety of his reaction. That's all he says about this encounter, other than him, realizing he probably wet himself. But what if, in line with his lust for bondage and submission and roleplay, after he shoots that guy, Harold dreams about that moment he pulled the trigger, relives that moment, fantasizes about that moment, and he comes to realize that he likes to kill. Sure, maybe that's too close to apt pupil for comfort, but even if it was part of a monologue somewhere, part of his ledger, if there were any type of reference to this at all, this should affect him. Maybe I'm a little sensitive on this topic because I finally like this section of the book, and Harold's journey is probably the main reason I do. Him and Larry, and Nadine too, their love triangle, even if Harold was merely a lover by proxy for a dark bridegroom Flag. Exploring their struggle to do what's right or what's wrong, how they come to grips or not with the responsibilities forced upon them by these otherworldly forces, all of that, it's good. It's all so good. Honestly, with another George Lucas level touch up to better blend the befores and afters. All of this could be easily rectified. And like the almost now oddly unanimously Boulder Free Zone adopted U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, perhaps even improved upon. Look, even if at the very least the stand were ever so slightly redistributed so that all of the pre-Boulder stuff from Book 2 were sheared off and then lumped in with the last couple chapters of Book 1 to make its own book within the larger story, Book 1.5, Getting to the Border, or for a touch of drama and keeping with King's love of Bruce Springsteen, maybe something like Born to Run. I think that would go a long way. Make Captain Trips end with, say, Lloyd being freed and Nick pedaling to Nebraska to go out on a high. Then the new Book 2, that'd start with Rita's death. Okay, so we go in on the low, change up energy a bit, and then progress through all the pre-Boulder stuff, right through Trash Can Man solo and Nadine wishing on a star. You lump those together, I mean, that's pretty nice. There's some pretty nice character arcs there. And with Book 3 on the border, then starting with Dawn coming up over the mountains in Boulder, pretty well balanced. Where it should end? I mean, I think it should probably end right where it is, but to be honest, I haven't started rereading Book 3 yet, so I'm not exactly sure. But let's talk about that next time, because this has been a Drunk on Writing Dissection Addendum focused on Book 2, On the Border, from Stephen King's The Stand. Before we end, I just want to add, despite everything that I've said, I really love this for the first time ever. Flaws included. I love it the way that it is, and I am glad we have every last word of this book. It's a masterpiece. I mean, it really, truly is. If you enjoyed this video and you're still here watching, thank you. Please subscribe and, help support the channel as a patron at drunkonwriting.com. You can get a bunch of extra content, and I think you'll enjoy it. Until then, until next time, cheers, and keep on writing.